Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, Daniel, for inviting me. I very much enjoyed listening to the speakers today, and I'm just privileged to be a part of this panel. I have been a prosecutor for over 25 years. Please, nobody do the math. I was a defense attorney before then. But for whatever reason, I've spent almost that entire amount of time prosecuting sex offenders, human traffickers, rapists, and child predators. And as a result of having done so many trials and worked with so many victims, helping them make that transition to become survivors, I've really become familiar with the red flags and all the types of things that make it possible for us to learn in advance what kind of person is likely to be a predator, what kind of techniques predators are likely to use, and probably most importantly, how we can proactively catch predators before they catch or groom or lure our children. So I'm hoping you can see my PowerPoint also. Let me give you a couple of examples straight from my own cases. And you can now see, I hope, the cover slide as we launch into the program. So balancing grace and justice. I hope you can see this slide. Please let me know if we're on the right page here. Okay, good. Balancing grace and justice. I call it from the classroom to the courtroom. There are lots of cases where we actually have to look, and we have to look very carefully to make sure that we're able to decide what types of people we allow into the lives of our children. And if we don't do that, we're likely not to have the kind of experience that we want when it comes to keeping our children safe. It looks like you are still seeing my cover slide. Let me see if I can figure out how to screen share in a fashion that we can actually move forward together. Let's see, let me share this again. Okay, let's see, it looks like it's one slide behind. Okay, I hope now you're seeing a slide that says trial experience. Oh, it looks like we're one slide behind, but I'll see if I can figure this out. So I have been a prosecutor for a lot of years. This is me in the courtroom acting out a shooting. And, you know, I always say the courtroom is the one place where you can act out crimes without getting shot, maced, or put on a watch list somewhere. It is the type of place where we bring these cases alive. And it's also the kind of place where a jury has the opportunity to hear firsthand, especially in cases of human trafficking, child molestation, or sexual predators, what it's really like for victims. More importantly, they're able to hear what it's like for the victims as they become victimized. They know what it's like for the parents who are just noticing the types of red flags, who are finally having the opportunity to actually see some of what they're able to see in terms of what they should be able to keep in touch with and what they should be able to notice proactively. And that's where you see these two books of mine. After having been a prosecutor for 15 years, I went back to school. I earned a master in divinity. I went on to earn a PhD in theology, and I started writing books on the red flags and the types of things in which we as parents, as educators, as criminal justice professionals could notice on the front end in order to make sure that we saw what was happening behind the scenes to our children. So the red flags actually are fairly counterintuitive to somebody that isn't intimately familiar with the process of grooming. Now, your last couple of speakers were familiar, and you heard some very good tips in terms of the types of things that traffickers, that pimps, that other kinds of exploiters would look for on the front end. So that's the kind of thing that we're looking for as well. So when I go to court, if we want to go to the next slide, when I go to court, I almost feel like my jurors expect to see sexual predators rolling up to the courthouse in a van like this. This is not what they look like. They come in high-end Mercedes or a Lexus or some kind of a flashy sports car. They don't look like predators look like in the movies. And that is what makes my job difficult. They also look like this. So we can go to the next slide. Predators are often very handsome. They are often very pretty. They're both men and women. You may recognize Mary Kay Letourneau on this compilation of women. And if you remember her case, she actually groomed, lured, and impregnated a young boy, 22 years her junior, who she first met when he was a student in her second grade class. Were there red flags? You bet there were. And this is actually one of my favorite case studies to teach parents what kinds of red flags were flying bright red at the time. If we go to the next slide, you'll see one of my own trials. Some of what I did is prosecuted school teachers who were having sex with their students, both men and women. And this is one of my female school teachers in her 30s, married to a police officer who was having sex with her 12-year-old student. Now, these are the types of things that really surprise jurors who aren't prepared to wrap their minds around the reality that you can have a nice looking woman sitting at the defendant's table, dressed as I am today in a nice dress and pearls, who stands accused of a crime like that. That's what makes these cases very hard to prove. So we prepare our victims from the very minute we meet them to be able to have sort of that verdict-focused investigation. So let's go to the next slide and see a little bit more about what this looks like. And when you talk through what these cases really look like and what we really should be looking for, we look probably a little harder at the spotting of sexual predators and what I call the ABCs of spotting sexual predators. So let's go to the next slide and take a look at what the A is really all about. Access. Who has access to your children? This is another one of my cases about a karate teacher, a beloved karate teacher who was well known in his community, well trusted. Everybody liked him, but he had access to all the kids that were taking lessons at the dojo. And he started molesting some. Who did he choose? He didn't choose the smartest, the ones with the best grades. He chose the ones that were socially awkward. They were vulnerable. And when they testified in front of the jury, the jurors had a tough time following some of the testimony because of the speech impediments, the delays, the developmental delays, the kinds of things that didn't make them good witnesses, but made them good victims. Those are the types of things I, as a prosecutor, look for early on to try to figure out how can we protect this community, these young people, not the ones that are sharpest and the fastest and the smartest, but the ones that have some challenges in life. Maybe they are social challenges. Maybe they're mental challenges. Maybe they're physically challenged in some sense. But to predators, that only makes them good victims because they're not going to do well on the witness stand. But this was a case that thankfully, because of corroboration in terms of other witnesses and sort of the way this dojo was laid out, I finally was able to get a conviction on some of the counts, not all of the counts. These cases are tough. Let's look at the next slide. And this is part of the way access makes victimizing easier, is access allows predators to overcome stranger danger. Many children instinctively won't get into a car with a stranger, which is a good thing, but they will get into a car with a stranger that they know because it's a teacher. Maybe it's a karate teacher, it's an educator, it's an after-school coach. It's someone they recognize, it's somebody who knows their name, and it's somebody that has perhaps been grooming them for exactly that hookup after school when they're not expecting it, and they come by and maybe invite this person over to their house. And that's how sometimes these children are exposed to things, to adult material that they shouldn't be. Here's something else that's pretty scary. Best friends? How old should a best friend be? Probably age appropriate, wouldn't you say? But pathological identification is what some of these predators suffer from because their peer group is too young. Their peer group is not their same age peers, but it's children, it's adolescents. I'll give you a perfect example here. This was that case I was showing you where a school teacher having sex with a 12-year-old student. She was in her 30s. Her best friend was 16. That's a peer group deviant. Peer group deviance sometimes occurs with predators because they honestly, authentically relate better to a very young age group. Now, this is a red flag we can see as adults because maybe we know people in our community that only seem to associate with young people. You know, Mary Kay Letourneau was a perfect example of this. This is an interview she did with Barbara Walters because she was very open about spending time with this young victim of hers who then became her husband and the father of her children. And the way she described this progression, the way she described it, and this is the scariest thing of all in the next slide, if you want to look at this quote, unbelievable. She described a connection between this youngster when he was in her second grade class. She described this almost deviant sense of connection with a second grader as this understanding between them, like a second grader is even capable of that. This understanding between them that grew into what you see depicted here. A romance that grew and developed throughout the years, throughout her prison term, and then finally when she was released, the marriage. And she celebrated a 10-year anniversary before the divorce and sadly before her untimely death. Let's go to the B for behavior. This is the ABCs of sexual predators. One thing sexual predators have in common, whether they're traffickers, whether they're just child predators, child molesters, rapists, you name it, is they don't follow the rules. Not necessarily just with respect to sexual boundary rules, but anything. They're tough to supervise in the workplace. They don't think the law should apply to them. They're very difficult in a social setting because they just don't mind their manners and they don't think they should have to. Now, here's something else that they have in common in terms of behavior. They objectify women and girls. This is a photograph of a show about, it's kind of a tiara for toddlers type show. It's a show that showcases young children as models. And they had this gorgeous, pretty little girl dressed up as Julia Roberts in Pretty Woman when she had the role of a sex worker. That should not be attire for a 5 or a 6-year-old. But some of the things that sexual predators and traffickers have in common, big red flag, is they objectify children. They like to have children in provocative clothing. They also probe boundaries. Now, when I was growing up at the end of the evening, because I've been around for many years, there was a test pattern that came on the television set in my state. And that told you that the programs were over for the day. Test patterns is what predators live by. They're testing the boundaries. They're not necessarily jumping right to sexual exploitation, but they're trying to figure out how far they can push the envelope. That leads us to communication. Now, communication doesn't often occur with strangers approaching your children with pockets full of candy and trench coats. That's too obvious, and you've warned your kids about that. It's far more insidious. It's rapport building with young people. So we've got the access with the A, the behavior with the B, and then we're rapport building, if we want to go to the next slide. And we do that through the way in which we establish this relationship. We do it through similarity. Now, this is 2 women and a canine at a dog show that have something in common: gorgeous blonde hair. Our predators that walk among us in society will find something that they share in common with your child. It doesn't matter how old your child is. It doesn't matter if they're a teenager or a 2-year-old. They'll find common ground in order to bond. This is another one of my defendants. This is a defendant, a sexually violent predator here on the next slide, that described for Dr. Phil the way he used different things in order to bond with his victims. Let's see if we can play the video and hear right from a predator's own mouth what he did. It doesn't look like the video is going to play for us. All right, I'll tell you what he said. He explained that he would even mirror the vocal intonations of his young victims. He would raise his voice. He would lower his voice if he needed to. He would dress the way they dressed. He would do everything he could. He would bring lures, as he called them, little shiny trinkets that the children like to look at. All of this in order to be able to find something to identify with. So let's go now to the next slide and talk a little bit more about how the age appropriateness of the communication should be a red flag. We care about the topics and the conversations that strangers bring up with our kids. We should never overhear a stranger asking our child for help of any kind, whether it's directions or finding their lost puppy. Nothing. We also find, in terms of conversation topics, that one of the lures that predators use is they talk about adult topics. These interviewing techniques, they ask your child about whether or not they have a parent, mommy or daddy, that watches the computer, that gives them a cell phone, that shows them the kinds of things they should look at or wear. That's because, as other speakers have already discussed, a lot of grooming nowadays happens online. Now, if we could move to the almost second to last slide, I want to sort of bring it home with an explanation of one of the, there we go, that one. I had the opportunity, the privilege to be on a panel with Elizabeth Smart last year. And she was abducted and held for 9 months. She was abducted right from her home. And what she shared in terms of how we protect our children, I'll be talking more about this when I join you again tomorrow, is one of the biggest things that allowed her to move from victim to survivor is being believed right from the beginning when she was first rescued. And that is one of the ways in which we can be communicating with our children. Who has the access, look at the predator's behavior, and monitor that communication. And when we're able to look at those ABCs of sexual predators and discuss them with our children in a fashion that we believe what they tell us and are willing to listen and deconstruct and understand if there's any deception or dishonesty, understand exactly why and what they're facing with these predators right from the beginning of them being able to open up to us. That's how we're going to be able to take whatever has happened to them, even if they're embarrassed to tell us about it, and help us move towards being a survivor. So I think I have a little bit of an inspirational slide here I'd kind of like to end with on a high note. And I'll be, again, sharing much more detail tomorrow. But this is our ultimate goal, is we want to have everyone in our household safe. And we want to be able to catch those red flags on the front end so we don't ever have another child being a victim and falling prey to a sexual predator. Thank you very much for having me.